So this is Jesus' teaching on judgment. Nothing too controversial, except, of course, that we live in a very judgmental world. If you don't believe me, just log on to social media and scroll down to read some of the comments. Actually, don't do that. It's not really good for anyone. But I'm sure you know what I mean. You don't have to look too far to see judgment being passed. Whether it's judging the Prime Minister, judging someone who holds an opinion that is different to ours, judging someone's parenting decisions or friendship decisions or whatever it may be. We live in a judge or be judged kind of a world. So as followers of Jesus, we have to wrestle seriously with this teaching. So let's look through these verses together. Do not judge, verses 1 and 2. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So the first question here then is, what does Jesus mean by judge? Well, the word he uses is a Greek word, krino, and it implies kind of judgment with condemnation. He's saying don't judge others, don't condemn others. We're shaped, each of us, either by reconciliation or condemnation. When something isn't right, we either seek what is good for those concerned, or more often, if we're honest, we jump to judgment and condemnation. If we don't like something, we just cut it off and be done with it. This happened to me a little while ago. I did something that someone didn't like, and they jumped straight to that place of judgment and condemnation. They cut me off completely. I've not seen or spoken to them since. We see this kind of behaviour all the time in families, among friends, between co-workers, and sadly even in the church. Yet Jesus says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. In other words, when we judge with that kind of condemnation, the least we can expect is equally harsh judgment, firstly from others, but more than that, from God. Just as God promises to forgive those who forgive, so it seems God will also condemn those who condemn. And at that level, this teaching of Jesus sounds simple enough. Don't judge, don't condemn. But here's where it gets confusing. Making value judgments on people's behaviour is at times apparently okay. Actually, it is a requirement for us. There are other places in Scripture where we're clearly to call out sinful behaviour in other believers. So this teaching, do not judge, doesn't mean we can just ignore sin where we become aware of it. And if you want a riddle to ponder later on, I would suggest any attempt to avoid judging is defeated by this judgment of Jesus against those who judge. Jesus here is judging those who judge. This command doesn't mean that we don't hold ourselves to high standards of behaviour, just that we don't look down on others because of what we see. The problem here that Jesus is addressing, the heart issue, is that we so often have a fault-finding attitude combined with a blindness to our own failings. Which brings us to verses 3 to 5, and this bizarre image Jesus brings of the plank in our eye. And it is meant to be a ridiculous picture. It's meant to highlight our tendency to play down our own faults and failures while magnifying the faults and failures of other people. And the point of what Jesus is saying in this picture is not to make us feel really bad and guilty for the plank in our own eye, but just to help us recognise that we have our own stuff to deal with too. And so he goes on in verse 5. You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. A hypocrite is an accusation that is often thrown towards Christians. A hypocrite, in the time of Jesus, the language meant someone who wore a mask to pretend to be something other than what they were. We might say it's someone who is living a lie. Well, here Jesus is saying, if you want to avoid being a hypocrite, we first need to clean up our own act, get the plank out of our own eye first. Only after we've examined ourselves and we've allowed God to deal with our sin can we see clearly enough to begin helping someone else with the speck in their eye. You can just imagine, if you've got this huge kind of plank coming out of your own eye, the idea of then trying to get close enough to someone else to move the speck from theirs. Not only is it a ridiculous picture, it's dangerous. I might be genuinely trying to help that other person, but the plank sticking out of my own eye is likely to do them harm as well. I can't see clearly what is going on for the other person because my own stuff is in the way. The plank in my own eye changes what I see. So Jesus says, first take the plank out of my own eye, then I can see clearly to remove the speck from someone else's eye. So notice in this picture, there is a speck in the brother's eye. There is something in the other person that needs to be taken seriously. The hypocrite's error, according to Jesus, is not the diagnosis. It's not that they've noticed a speck in the other person's eye. It's the fact that they've failed to apply the same criticism, the same high standards of coming before God with our sin to themselves. So the first response to this teaching is to be committed to living holy and blameless lives, to bringing our own stuff before God and inviting God to deal with it. And then verse 6. Do not give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces. It's another slightly shocking statement to our ears particularly. Some scholars think that verse 6 is like a standalone statement of Jesus. Others see that it naturally flows on from verses 1 to 5. Well, in the time of Jesus, dogs and pigs was kind of shorthand for anyone who was outside of God's people. So the distinction in this verse 6 is between the community of God, the community of Jesus, and those outside of that community. We are to treasure and guard the message of the kingdom. Don't give what is sacred to those who are not among the faithful. What might that mean? Well, among other things, I think it means this high standard of removing planks or even specks from our eyes is for the people of God. If people don't get Jesus and his kingdom, why on earth would we expect them to get the call to holiness? How we talk about sin, how we relate to people about sin should be different depending on whether they are seeking to follow Jesus or not. If I'm out and about, and I'm talking to someone and discover that they're living with their partner that they're not married to and they're not Christians, I'm not likely to comment on that unless they specifically ask for my opinion as a Christian. If a member of the church, however, someone seeking to follow Jesus, is in that same scenario, I would seek to gently address that with them. It makes a difference in that one example as to whether or not someone is seeking to follow Jesus, as to whether I might then feel it right to say something. So that's the passage. We're to start by examining ourselves, inviting God to sort out the plank in our own eye. But I want to go back to the fact that there are various other passages where we are clearly expected to evaluate the behaviour of another believer and bring correction to them, to help them get the speck out of their eye, as it were. If we are going to take this teaching seriously and those other verses seriously, we need to get that there is a distinction between judgment and correction. Judgment is when we draw attention to a perceived evil in another person without loving them. Again, I had this a while ago where someone turned to me in a very public setting. I had the whole finger wagging. You know what you've done. You know what you've done. I mean, as it happened, I didn't know what I'd done. I'm still not sure to this day, but those words stuck with me and they hurt and they brought pain and shame to me in that moment. An evil, a perceived evil was being called out, but there was no love. There was no attempt to actually bring any resolution. Judgment is when we draw attention to a wrong that we perceive in someone simply to draw attention to it. And often from that we then make statements about the person's identity and not just their actions. Judgment so often is rooted in selfish and self-righteous motives. It produces shame in the other person. Judgment tends to deal in absolutes and leaves no room for grace. We see this in the rise of cancel culture, I think, where somebody makes one statement that another group disagrees with, and suddenly they're not welcome at any table or in any room. They don't get a voice in any conversation. How many times have we heard of politicians whose careers kind of come tumbling down because of an opinion they expressed as a teenager, possibly 20, 30, 40 years ago, and yet somebody finds a quote, and on that basis they're effectively cancelled. That's judgment in action. It leaves no room for grace or growth or any of those things. Perhaps more locally to ourselves, we have kind of cancel relationships. Judgment is the license that we use not to be in relationship with that person we don't like, that person who offended us once. And so we avoid them, we cut them off, we cut all ties. That's judgment. How then do we handle verses like 1 Corinthians 5, verse 12, about judging sinful believers? Or Jesus' teaching later in Matthew chapter 18, where he teaches us that if a brother or sister in Christ sins, we have a responsibility to go to them and point out their fault. How do we hold these things together? The goal, I believe, is to hold one another responsible without attacking each other's worth as human beings. What we need instead of judgment is correction. Correction is when we draw out the wrong in another person in a loving way that seeks the good of the individual, that seeks their restoration, the health of their relationship before God. And that kind of correction is always rooted in humility. If you have ever genuinely corrected somebody rather than judged them, you'll know that it's a really humbling thing to do. Because in the process of doing that, you become acutely aware of your own struggles, your own frailty, your own imperfection. And yet at the same time, you know that this is the most loving thing you can do for that person. Correction always brings people back to the way of Jesus. So judgment assesses the fault that we see in someone. Correction sees the person behind that fault and believes for their good, believes for their restoration. We are to be people of correction and accountability and responsibility. And it was really interesting on the recent Vision Day that was one of the themes that came out when we talked about discipleship. We want to be the kind of community that can do this for one another, recognizing how hard it is, but also how important. But we are not to be a community of judgment or condemnation. If we're going to avoid straying into judgment, it's going to help us if we can understand where that might be coming from. And psychologists say that when we judge, it tends to come from one of four things, and often these things overlap with one another. Firstly, when we're insecure, we often go to a place of judgment. If we're unhappy in some way with who we are, we try and bring others down to make us feel better. Now, it never actually helps, of course, to tear someone down, but we do it anyway. We try to make ourselves feel better by making them feel bad. Secondly, when we're scared, if we meet someone who is super impressive or who intimidates us, Again, we often go to a place of judgment. We see co-workers often do this against their boss. Girls, when they get together and they see a prettier girl, they might make fun of her hair or her outfit or her makeup or whatever. Again, it comes from a place of fear and insecurity. Thirdly, when we're lonely, if we're isolated, often we try to use judgment as a way of connecting or bonding with people through negativity. If we can get someone to join forces with us to tear someone else down, then we kind of form this strange sort of bond with them. And then fourthly, when we're seeking change, when there is something in our lives that we long to be different. So one obvious example, if somebody is single and wants to be in a committed relationship and their best friend gets engaged, they might say all sorts of mean things about the new fiancé. And it comes from a place of jealousy because actually there's something they long to be different for themselves and they can't bring themselves to see it in another. So these are the kinds of things that are in the background often when we go to a place of judgment. And the thing that they have in common is these are all areas of pain. These are all to do with the plank in our own eye. And what happens when we go to that place of judgment is everybody ends up being more hurt. Again, the psychologists actually say that when you judge someone, rather than feeling better about yourself, you feel worse. Judgment changes the emotional environment that we're in. It brings about kind of all sorts of negativity. And of course, when we listen to the teaching of Jesus, when we judge others, we're inviting harsh judgment on ourselves as well. So how do we move away from being judgmental? How do we kind of bring this together? What do we do with this teaching? Here's a few things we might do. Firstly, focus on yourself. Strange thing to hear in a sermon. Focus on yourself. Get the plank out of your own eye. Deal with the sin, the pain, the loneliness, whatever it is in you that makes you go to that place of judgment. Secondly, practice taking thoughts captive. Hold up each thought before God. When we're tempted to go to that place of judgment, hold up that thought and say to God, is this helpful? Is this thought honouring to you, God? And is it honouring to the other person? And then linked with that, look for the good. Don't focus just on the failure that we have seen, but on the person we've seen it in. Pray for their good. Believe the best in them. Long and pray for their coming good. Fourth, stop judging yourself. Now, the scriptures say it's good for us to invite God to search us and to know us and to seek out any anxious way in us. Inviting God to do that is good. Searching yourself usually goes one of two ways. Either we are overly harsh and we condemn ourselves in all sorts of areas where God has pronounced freedom and forgiveness. And we're overly harsh, we put ourselves down, and then that immediately leads into putting others down with us. Or on the other side, it means when we search ourselves, we avoid a whole load of things. We just ignore all the stuff that we don't want to go to. And we convince ourselves that none of that really needs to be dealt with and God doesn't mind. Either way, we need to stop playing judge for ourselves and allow God to be the one that searches our hearts. And then finally, remember how it feels. It's about empathy. Remember how it feels to be judged by another. If you've been on the wrong end of a judgment, remember how that feels before you go to that place for others. But also remember how it feels to be seen and to be loved. If you've ever had the experience of being lovingly corrected, remember that, so that you might then begin to do that for others. Just one really trivial example in many ways. When I was a student, I used to borrow lots of music. Everything was on CDs in those days. This was before streaming and downloads and all of that. I borrowed CDs from my flatmates, and there was one that I really, really loved, to the point where I couldn't resist the temptation to make a copy for myself. And when the following term she realised we were both playing it at the same time and worked out what had happened, she very lovingly came and sat with me and said, look, it's not right that you've done that. You've not bought that music, and we shouldn't both have a copy of it. I'm going to ask you to destroy that copy, which reluctantly I did. But actually the way she did it, the way she approached the conversation, was out of a place of love, wanting me to do what was right. And to be fair, she offered to buy me the CD as well, which helped. But actually it came from a place of love. To be lovingly corrected is one of the most powerful things we can do for one another. And ultimately it brought us closer together in our friendship. The call in this teaching is to see people as Jesus sees them, and to resist the temptation to play God, to lovingly correct without straying into judgment. Why don't we pray a moment?